This guide will mainly show the assembly of the SOIC-20 development board, which is part of my family of PC boards for builders. I'll also include some examples of the assembly of a few of the other boards. Before we start, let's talk about some of the supplies you will need. I find a small diameter solder works well for these small surface mount parts. I'm using some 15 mil or 0.38 millimeter flux core 6040 solder. For cleaning up excess solder, some solder braid can be useful. This one is some fine braid 1 millimeter. The solder I use has a flux core, but sometimes it can be useful to have some extra flux available. And finally, a fine tip for your soldering iron. As an option to hand soldering, you can also use a hot plate to solder multiple parts or even multiple boards at the same time. So let's get started with the top of the board. This board supports either a narrow SOIC-14 or a wide SOIC-20 pin DD series AVR part. Note the pin 1 markings on each device and that of the PCB. For this assembly, I will use the 20 pin 64DD20 part. I usually start with the larger surface mount devices and work toward the outside, but any method you choose will work. Just make sure you have enough working area around the part you are applying. Even though the solder I use has a flux core, I'm going to add some additional flux for this part as an example. Along with all the other properties of flux, this will further aid in heat transfer and an even solder flow. I'm speeding up the video to save some time. Usually I'll mount all the parts in the same way by adding a small amount of solder to one of the pads and using that to tack the part in place. I'll then solder all the pins to complete the mounting of that part. However, in this case, the flux is helping to hold the part in place. Make sure you have the proper orientation of the part. This device has a small dot notating where the pin is located. It should align with the pin 1 markings on the PCB. I'm speeding up the video to save some time. Since this is a large part, I'm going to quickly clean it with some ISP for electronics and check the pins. I'll continue with mounting the resistors using the tack method mentioned earlier. And now I'll mount the transistors. I'm now moving to the bottom of the board. There are only a few capacitors to mount on the bottom of the board, so I'm doing those now. I'm continuing the assembly with the remaining resistors and transistors. This assembly is almost complete. You should now review and touch up any connections. And finally, clean any residual flux from the top and bottom of the board. Some of the development boards have solder bridges to set certain options. This SOIC14 board uses one to select either ICSP or UPDI for programming the part. To make a solder bridge, just add some solder to the two pads you want to connect until they are a uniform connection. This is the ICSP or SPI selection, and UPDI. The ATmega 328 board uses 4 solder bridges to select the I/O line to drive a transistor. It also uses a through-hole 28-pin part, so this is an example of mounting that socket. The ATtiny85 board has an option of either a through-hole or a surface mount part. Check that the socket notch aligns with the PCB silkscreen and place it on the board. I've bent a couple of the pins to help hold the socket in place. I'll also check that the socket is flush to the PCB after I solder the first pin. These parts usually need a bit more solder, so I use a larger diameter 34 mm for all my through-hole parts. This completes my development board assembly guide. Please visit my Tindy page for purchasing either blank or assembled boards, and you can check out my GitHub for a detailed assembly guide and schematic. The links are provided in the video description below.